good to see you. If you've not been around for a little while, we've been in a series where we have been exploring a number of different kind of spiritual practices. And really, what we're trying or attempting to do is to define what it looks like for us as a church community to have what we're calling a shared rule of life. A rule of life is something that's existed in the Christian tradition for centuries. And it's not like a set of rules where you tick a box and you somehow earn favor with God. Instead, a rule of life is really about creating rhythms in our life, a framework, if you like, that help us to follow Jesus and order our everyday lives around him in the hope that we will be transformed, that we will be shaped and transformed by him. And so the word rule, it comes from the Latin, which is regular, which means trellis. And so if you are the gardening type, you will know that a trellis is this kind of wooden frame that helps plants and vines to grow. The trellis doesn't give life, but it gives a structure that helps create the right conditions for plants and vines to grow healthily. And so, in the same way, a rule of life is like our spiritual trellis. It gives our lives structure and supports what we need to grow and produce fruit. Fruit, Jesus said, that will remain. And so we would grow and mature in him because we have this kind of framework that helps us to do that. And so to help us do this, we put together a little booklet which you can download, which we are calling Rhythm of Renewal. And in there, we've got a list of like 7 kind of key practices that we think could help form what it means for us to have a rule of life. And then to kind of get this in our minds and to embed it in our muscle memory, if you like, we're using this acronym of renewal as a way to just kind of shape our thoughts towards various different practices. And so R is for read, which is simply about immersing ourselves in the scriptures, letting God's word anchor our lives. E was for eat, which was all about opening up our homes and extending our tables in hospitality. N was for neighbor, which was about living lives that are kind of focused towards others around us. The other E was empower, which was all about blessing others with our words and actions so that others can be strengthened and encouraged. W was worship. We talked about living lives, both in the corporate sense of worship, but also worship in our everyday lives as well. A is for abide, which is about finding Sabbath and rest in a restless world. And L is listen, which is all about prayer and silence and solitude and just creating space in our lives for us to hear God. And so as we lean into our next practice, let me start with a simple observation that most of us, I think, will know to be true. Okay? And my observation is this. Have you noticed that when you ask somebody, how was your week? The number one answer you get, like 95% of the time, the answer you will get is, it's been busy. Yeah? How's your week? Oh, it's been busy. Or then if you slightly change the question to, well, how are you feeling today? How are you doing today? Then the most common response you will get is, I'm tired. It's like in our modern world, we've normalized exhaustion. And often, I don't know if you've met people like this, but we wear exhaustion like a badge of honor. And yet, at the same time, if you were to flick through some of the popular magazines on the shelf, you will see advertisements where they're trying to sell us a certain lifestyle. Maybe there's a picture of a couple drinking coffee in bed, reading the Sunday newspapers, relaxing, or maybe there's a man lounging on his sofa, playing his guitar, or maybe there's a group of friends that, they're on the beach having a picnic, just like taking in the joys of life. We've all seen those kind of images, and there's something quite telling about those kinds of images, because in a world that's busy and tired nearly all of the time, the thing that is often being sold to us is this very ancient practice that the Bible refers to as Sabbath. Now, the word Sabbath comes from the Hebrew, from the word Shabbat, which literally means to stop, to cease, or to be done. And you see, the marketing departments of companies the world over know that all of us ache for that kind of lifestyle. We all long for that kind of life. And they also know that on the whole, many of us don't have it. And so what they attempt to do is they attempt to sell it to us as if you could buy Sabbath. But the truth is, to Sabbath, you don't need to spend $69.99 on a territorially robe so you can relax, okay? You don't need to buy that sofa. To Sabbath, all you need to do is stop. And so as we lean in today's practice, we're talking about what it means to abide, what it means to abide and be at peace in God's presence. That's where we are in our acronym. And so we're going to look at this practice of Sabbath. And so if you've got a Bible, we're going to be turning to Matthew 11. And incidentally, if you haven't got a Bible and you would like to own a Bible, we would love to give you a Bible. And so do feel free to grab a Bible from the welcome desk over there. It's yours. You can put your name in the front and keep it and read it. And enjoy that. So that's our gift to you this morning if you don't have a Bible. So Matthew 11 and verses 28 to 30. And so this is Jesus speaking. It's probably one of Jesus's most famous invitations to us. And he says this: "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." As I say, this is a famous invitation of Jesus's. And I love the way Eugene Peterson paraphrases this in the Message. He says this: Are you tired? Are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me, get away with me, and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep good company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. Are you tired? Has kind of become the rhetorical question of our age. Of course you are. Low-grade exhaustion is actually our new normal. But Jesus comes along and he invites us to something radically different. And it almost sounds foreign to our ears, doesn't it? You will find rest for your soul. Not rest from your schedule, not a slightly better night's sleep, but rest for your soul. He says, come to me, all who are weary. The Greek word weary literally means those living at a pace that produces exhaustion. Sound like anyone you know? Probably all of us, right? We live in a world that pushes us to go faster and faster. We hurry, even the things that cannot be hurried. How many of us go into a lift and we press the button multiple times because we think it's going to close the doors quicker? Or how many of us were in the supermarket and we're like gauging, if I stand in this queue, I may get through quicker than that queue? Or how many of us speed up at traffic lights when they turn amber? Because heaven forbid, I can't wait for another couple of minutes. You see, we're living at a pace of life that our souls simply cannot sustain. And here's the irony. Our technological age was supposed to save us time. Did you know back in the 1960s, a bunch of experts went to the US Senate and they said because of the advancement of technology, soon people would work fewer hours, they would retire earlier, and they would struggle to find things to do with all the free time. Well, how did that prediction go? Not that well, was it? Not that well. As many of us know, as technology has advanced, it actually means the opposite. Instead of working less, what do? We work more. Instead of slowing down, we speed up. We make calls while we're driving. We send emails whilst we're having lunch. Or we scroll ourselves to sleep. As one author says, never before in human history has a society been so things rich and so time poor. And even in the church, research found the number one thing preventing people growing spiritually. Do you know what the number one reason people give was? I'm too busy. And it's no surprising that Jesus' invitation cuts deeply, doesn't it? We are the weary ones he's talking to. Those who are living at a pace that produces exhaustion. And so he says, come to me, all who are weary, all who are exhausted. Come to me, all who are weary, and he says, burdened. You see, not only are we weary to the point of exhaustion, but we are also burdened. And we all carry burdens, don't we? That has an effect on how awake and how alive we actually feel. We carry burdens of grief, of loss, of worry, or stress, or anxiety, loneliness. We carry burdens of financial pressures. We carry relational pressures. They're all burdens that are a reality to us. Maybe you're carrying a burden this morning. Burdens that rob you of life and life into its fullest. Burdens that keep you awake at night, thinking, pondering, cause your mind to always be on the go. And what does Jesus say? He says, come to me and I will give you rest. I'll give you rest. You see, Jesus isn't a hard taskmaster. He doesn't say, come to me and you're just going to have to try a bit harder. He doesn't say, come to me and manage your time a bit better. He just says, come to me. Jesus says, take my yoke upon you and learn from me. Now, many of us will know what a yoke is, but for those who don't, a yoke was this thing that kind of rested over the shoulders of an ox in order for that ox to pull a load. But it's also important to add its language, the language of yoke was also used by rabbis and teachers in relationship to their disciples, those who were following them. And so when a person became a disciple of a rabbi, when they began to follow them, it was often referred to as taking on the yoke of your rabbi. And so a disciple would commit themselves to wholeheartedly submitting themselves to the kind of teachings and understanding of the scriptures and the way that their rabbi did life, they too would do life. That was their rabbi's yoke. And so when Jesus says these words, take my yoke, he's not just using a metaphor, but he's also saying, center your life around me, imitate me. Take my yoke. And his phrasing is super intentional here. He says, come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and take my yoke. In other words, take my burden. He's saying very clearly here that we come to me with your burdens and exchange them for mine. And the kind of intent here and the recognition here is that the burdens that we carry are heavy. The burdens that we carry are oppressive, exhausting. And Jesus says, come on, let's exchange burdens. That's way too heavy for you to carry. And you see, we all yoke ourselves, don't we? We can yoke ourselves to all kinds of things. We can yoke ourselves to achievement. And so we become people who are overcome by comparison. That's a heavy burden to carry, isn't it? A burden of comparison. We can be yoked to appearance. And so we build our lives around becoming something we're not. You know, we just kind of carry this facade, this kind of false image of ourselves. That's a burden. We can carry the yoke of approval, where we live lives longing for the approval of someone else. That's exhausting. That's tiring. But Jesus says, take my yoke. Take my burden, because I'm gentle and humble of heart, and you will find rest for your soul. That Jesus wants to give us a burden that's light, a burden that offers us rest for our soul. And so Jesus' invitation to all of us is to have what Marva Dawn calls a Sabbath spirituality, a lifestyle lived from a place of rest. And this is why this practice of Sabbath is so important. And so in the time that we've got left this morning, I just want to offer us three things that I think the scriptures offer us as we kind of try to understand why this thing called Sabbath is an important issue. And so first of all, Sabbath is a rhythm of creation. It's in the rhythm of creation. Think about the creation story. If you've got a Bible, turn quickly, Genesis chapter 2. It says this, Genesis 2, it says, thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested all from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. Now, the big thing that we notice in this passage is that God Sabbath. The Almighty, the All-Powerful, the God of the universe, Sabbathed. If ever there was a thought that we could opt out or object to this practice, we just need to turn to this passage. And maybe you could argue, well, I'm just an A-type personality. I like to get things done. I like to be on the go and, I can't stop. That's fine. But just know God, Sabbath. Or maybe you're like, well, I'm just a doer. You know, I'm just a doer. I've got a lot going on right now, and if I don't do it, the world does revolve around me. And so my self-importance means I can't actually stop. That's fine. But God's Sabbath. Or, I've got little kids, they're always on the go. And I'm trying to start this like business, this side hustle. I can't really stop. That's fine. But know that God's Sabbath. God, the creator of all things, stopped. And in doing so, he built a rhythm into the fabric of creation. You see, we work for 6 days and then we Sabbath. We stop for one. It should be no surprise that every single society in human history has been built around a 7-day week. Did you know during the French Revolution in the late 1700s, there was an attempt at a 10-day week with the goal of upping productivity? And the result actually had the opposite effect. Productivity actually went down. And worse than that, there was a huge spike in suicides and a huge impact on people's mental health. I think in some ways we're reliving a similar reality in our age. Not because of the French government trying to elongate the week, but because we live in a modern world that never switches off and robs us from that sense of rhythm. Alex Pang, in his book Rest, he writes, working better does not mean working more. It means working less and resting better. You see, even in secular research and from a secular point of view, the reality is that the benefits always point back to God's design. And so Sabbath is this rhythm that we find in creation itself. Secondly, Sabbath is a command. Flick over to Exodus 20, verses 8 to 11. It says this, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your sons or your daughters, nor your male or female servants, nor your animals, nor your foreigners residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that's in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. You see, the idea of Sabbath isn't just this kind of good idea, but it's one of the 10 commandments. Anybody heard of the 10 commandments? It's one of the 10 commandments. And actually, it's the longest of the 10 commandments. If the 10 commandments were a pie chart, it would be like 37% of the 10 commandments. And in God's economy, it's just as or maybe more important than lying, stealing, or killing, if we're saying they're in a certain order. And have you noticed it's the only commandment we're willing to break and brag about? Even in the moral decay of our world, not many people are bragging about how many lies they told this week or how many affairs they had. Yet many of us brag about how many days in a row we worked or how busy we've been. Now, some of you are questioning whether the Sabbath is still a binding command for those who follow Jesus. After all, we live under grace. We don't live under the law. But here's the thing. Asking whether we have to keep the Sabbath or not is about as helpful as asking, do we have to keep the second law of thermodynamics? You can work with it or you can work against it. But it just is. It's just there. Even if the Sabbath command is no longer binding, it's still wisdom. Lots of things aren't commands in the scriptures, but they are essential to us becoming the kind of people we long to be. Wayne Muller put it this way. He said, the Sabbath is not a burdensome requirement from some law-giving deity. You ought, you better, you must, but rather a remembrance of a law that is firmly embedded in the fabric of nature. It is a reminder of how things really are, the rhythmic dance in which we unavoidably belong. See, Jesus famously said, didn't he, in Mark chapter 2, the Sabbath was made for people, not people for the Sabbath. And he was speaking to a generation that had the opposite problem to you and me. You see, they had hundreds of rules around the Sabbath that obscured God's intent behind what it meant to have a day of rest. So for Jesus's first century hearers, the second half of that line, the Sabbath was made for people, not people for the Sabbath, was the important one. But in a world that's void of rest and unable to stop, we need to hear the first part. The Sabbath was made for people. Our problem isn't that we have too many rules for Sabbath. It's that we don't have any. Okay, my final point. Sabbath is resistance. In his book, Sabbath as Resistance, Walter Brueggemann argues that Sabbath is not just a spiritual practice. It's also an act of resistance against the dominant culture that forces us to, it deforms what it looks like to be human. Yes, Sabbath is God's gift, but it's also God's protest. It's a protest against a system that's built on exhaustion, dehumanization, and enslaves people. And what Brueggemann does is he roots this idea of Sabbath in the Exodus narrative. And he says, when God's people were enslaved in Egypt, it was an empire that was built on endless work, relentless production, zero rest, and a belief that people existed to produce for the empire. Pharaoh never let the Israelites rest, not even one day. Their value was tied entirely to how many bricks they could make. Brueggemann says this, our modern world looks far more like Pharaoh's Egypt than God's kingdom. We live under constant pressure to produce, achieve, and keep up. And his argument is this, Sabbath is God's no to Pharaoh. You see, Sabbath declares that human worth is not tied to productivity. It confronts the lie that you are what you do. Instead, it declares you are who you are loved by. When we stop working, producing, achieving, God still delights in us. Sabbath resists anxiety, scarcity, and the myth of more. You see, in Pharaoh's economy, and I think we've got these on the slides, in Pharaoh's economy, it was rooted in scarcity. There will never be enough, produce more. But God's economy is rooted in abundance. There's enough. He will provide. Sabbath is a weekly act of trusting that God is enough. You know, when the Israelites were led into the wilderness and God provided bread from heaven and he instituted Sabbath. Do you remember that? Sabbath became part of their experience in the wilderness. And he said to them, collect what food you need for the day. If you collect too much, it's going to go bad. But collect what you need. But on the sixth day, collect enough for the Sabbath. And you see, when we lean into Sabbath, we're trusting God's enough. He is enough. He will provide enough for us. Sabbath resists consumption. Our culture tells us you are a consumer. Your purpose is to buy. But Sabbath calls us to stop consuming, to stop filling our emptiness with stuff. Sabbath shifts us from consumption to contentment. Sabbath resists the commodification of people. You see, when everything is about productivity and profit, people become commodities. Employees become resources. Relationships become transactional. Rest becomes laziness, and worth becomes performance. Sabbath says people are not commodities. People are image bearers. People are gifts. And Sabbath humanizes people again. It reminds us of our humanity. And then finally, Sabbath reminds us of our freedom. You see, the God of Israel, the, the God who liberates slaves, when we practice Sabbath, we participate in liberation, liberated from hurry, liberated from anxiety, liberated from our addiction to achievement, liberated from the fear of falling behind, liberated from the tyranny of more. You see, Sabbath is not a law that restricts, but it's a rhythm that frees us. Sabbath is a weekly revolt against the script of our culture, a rebellion against Pharaoh-like forces of consumption, production, exhaustion, and anxiety. A declaration that God, not work, not success, not money, not busyness, is our source and our sustainer, God himself. You see, Sabbath doesn't just restore us, but it helps us to resist the world that breaks us. And so what's our challenge for this week? Well, in a world that's always moving, what would it look like for you to stop? What would it look like for you to rest? Like really rest? And you know, the answer to this challenge is going to be different for each one of us. For some of us, it might mean, like in the average working week, we actually take a lunch break. You know, we just take a lunch break and just turn off the computer screen and breathe. It might mean turning off the endless news cycle or the next message that needs answering. That might be our starting point. Others of us might be beyond that. And we might be ready to think about what would it look like if I stopped for like 24 hours? If I set aside 24 hours to stop and delight and just rest well? What would it look like for you to be unproductive? And I'm conscious as I say that, some of you feel this thing inside. That's a tension. That's hard because it's going against the grain, isn't it? It's going against everything we've been taught, everything we've been shaped by. And again, if you're going to stop for 24 hours, it's going to look different for different people. For many of you, Sunday is like the obvious day for you to stop for 24 hours. Don't quite work for me. But for many of you, that is the day that you might choose. Like, you know what? I'm going to be unproductive. It doesn't mean you can't serve on a team, but but what does it? Because that's worship, you know. Um, but what would it look like to have that day? For Tammy and I, for the last number of years, our Sabbath has kind of started on a Friday evening and gone through to Saturday. Now, that's not because we're trying to be like super religious or, you know, go back to our Jewish roots. It's just because it works. It's like the best space that we have in our schedule. But what would it look like for you to create a space for that habit? And as we said all along for all of these practices, this isn't about heavy burdens. It would be ironic, wouldn't it, if this was like suddenly this heavy burden after we've looked at a scripture where Jesus said, my burdens are light. So this isn't about laying heavy burdens on people, but this is about choosing to enter into rhythms that lighten our load. And so don't hear law, don't hear you must, but receive God's grace in the midst of this. What would it look like for you to stop? If you can't do 24 hours, what does it look like to stop for 12 hours or 6 hours? But what does it look like to stop? I know some of you are going to have hives as a result of this, but what does it look like to stop? Maybe for some of us, it's just helpful to know that if you stop, the world still spins. And that email that needed answering, it can be answered a few hours later. That task that needed doing, it can be done another time. And it's okay. That's okay. So we've gone horribly close or over time. Why don't we quickly stand and we'll pray. We're now going to hurry. No. Yeah, Holy Spirit, we just welcome your presence right now. We just say, come, Holy Spirit. Come and be amongst us as your people, Lord.